Back to the warnings regarding the audio listeners. Let's show the console and clear those out. When we press play and start the game, so far so good, but as soon as I press escape, I start getting the warnings. Our audio listeners are components of our cameras, so this warning lets us know that we have two cameras active at the same time. We see the FPS controller is active and we know it has a camera. Under the game controller, in the settings canvas, in the settings panel, there is the other camera which is active. Since the game is paused, this camera should be enabled, but the FPS controller should be disabled. Why is it not being disabled when the escape key is pressed? Let's go investigate. I'll go back to the game controller script and find the pause method. We see the line of code that should be turning off the FPS controller, but that only runs if the FPS controller is not null. Maybe the FPS controller was not set when the new scene loaded. If we go up to the start method, we see the line of code that is setting the FPS controller. But remember, the start method only runs once when the game object the script is attached to is instantiated. The FPS controller did not exist in the splash scene when this start method executed. So we need to set the value of this property after the new scene is loaded, and there is an FPS controller to reference. There are probably many places we could do this. We could go into the start method of any script attached to the FPS controller and then call a setter method that we create in the game controller to allow us to set the FPS controller property. This would likely be a good solution. However, I'm going to be a bit lazy and go with a quicker solution. In the update method, I'll just add if FPS controller is null, then set the FPS controller to the game object in the hierarchy with the name FPS controller. Yes, this is not the most elegant solution. Every time the update runs, the condition will have to be checked. But it is a simple check requiring no real processing time, and once the FPS controller is set, the condition will always return false. And so the code following it would never have to execute again. Let's save this and test it out. Press start to load scene 01, and then escape to pause the game. And now the warnings are gone. Yay! However, upon further thought, this is not a good solution. While there is no problem with this line of code being in the update method for scenes that do have an FPS controller, the code is problematic being in the update method for scenes that do not have an FPS controller. In scene 01, where there is an FPS controller, the condition is true only the first time the update method runs. Because the condition fails thereafter, the find method only executes once. In terms of processing, checking the condition is inexpensive. However, it takes much more processing time to use the find method, especially for scenes with many game objects. In the splash scene, or any other scene where there is no FPS controller, the find method would be constantly looking through all game objects in your scene to find those with the name of FPS controller. Calling the find method from inside the update method, or any method that runs repeatedly, is usually a bad idea. I am still feeling lazy though, so instead of the solution I originally described, let's just move this line of code into the pause method. So far at least, we do not need a reference to the FPS controller until the game is paused, and this code does not repeat constantly, it only runs at the moment the game is paused. Let's save and run this again. Press start to load scene 01, and then escape to pause the game. No errors and no warnings. Good. I can still switch to the audio settings. Let's set the background audio to about 50% and mute the sound effects. I can click the Return to Game button or press Escape to return to the game. Let's run into the water to make sure the water panel is still working. Very good. Now let's run into the door and see how well our loading of scene 02 goes. Okay, not too bad. We see in the hierarchy that we are now in scene 02 and the game controller is still there. Plus, there are no errors. That's a big plus. So what's up with this loading screen showing? Stop the game and open scene 02 in the editor. In the inspector, there's the culprit. We no longer need the canvas with the load panel here because our game controller contains the load panel now. We just right-click on the canvas and delete. Save and go back to the splash scene. Play the game and get to scene 2. Looks like it loaded smoothly. Everything seems to be working well with no errors. Even our flashlight still works. Let's run back through the door to return to scene 1. Everything appears to work and there are no errors showing. However, we are now hearing both the background audio and sound effects at full volume again. If we press Escape and look at the audio settings, they're back to 100%. I think that's because we started to replay the game. But if we did set the background audio back to 50% and mute it again, and press Escape, it's much quieter now. But let's see if that retains when I go through the door, and then back. So I think it sounds at full volume again. If I press Escape, our sliders and checkboxes are still set correctly. But when the scene loads, these values are not being applied. When we make a change to the slider UI elements, the settings will be applied. I'll just slightly change the volume slider for the background audio and check off and back on the muted checkbox for sound effects. When I return to the game, the audio settings have been applied. We really need these settings to be applied when a new scene is loaded as well. Stopping the game and looking at the game controller script, remember in the start method we had some code to set the initial values of the audio UI elements, and we added event listeners to these UI elements that would run the update volume method when their values were changed. If we change the initial value of the sliders to 0.5F, save and play the game again. When I press Escape and look at the audio settings, I see the UI elements were set correctly. But again, when I return to the game and press Start, the audio is at full volume. If I go into the audio settings now, the UI elements retained their state. But again, the values from these UI elements are not being applied unless we actually make another change to them. Stop the game and return to the code. We could comment in the call to the update volume method that we have just under where we set the UI elements. Or we could place the value changed listeners before the code that changes the values, so then the update volume method would automatically happen. But I tried both of these before with no luck, which is why I added the comment. Maybe it would work now that we have made other changes, or maybe we could try to figure out why it is not working. But now I think it may be a waste of our time because this start method only executes when the game controller is first instantiated, not every time a new scene is loaded. We do need to call the update volume method, but we need to do it from some other method. There is no method in the game controller script that runs every time a new scene is loaded.